I'm Glenn Loury, Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. Oh, I don't know that it can teach us all that much. I mean, I thought it was overblown as being emblematic of race relations or profiling or anything of that sort. I didn't read it as, insightful or really useful in that regard. Though I do think how we reacted to the incident, what it became, drawing the president in and so on, perhaps would tell us something about, and this was my argument in the piece, how we process racial issues, how we talk and don't talk about them, maybe how we are quick to repair to some conventional and pat storyline about them. The country had a problem, has had a problem, is trying to overcome it. Some people are slower at that than others. There's a racist behind every bush. Let's not tolerate the racist. This kind of talk. And I just thought the Gates incident, and again, the president's handling of it, showed the thinness of that narrative, how that line was probably not any longer, if ever it was, adequate to capture the reality of our racial condition, if you will. I don't want to pretend to omniscience here, but I'd say there are several aspects of it that I would point out. One is the continuing fact of a developmental lag or gap between the African American population taken as a whole, not of course including every person on the one hand, and the rest of the, much of the rest of the country on the other. Blacks are not the only group of people who manifest certain of the kinds of problems that I would talk about here and that are reflected in policing and prisons. Problems of poor education and intermittent employment and limited full human development, problems of fragile and fractured communities and families, of large numbers of under-socialized and underdeveloped young people who end up getting into trouble, of, and I could go on, and you see the line that this would draw. It would say that the African American population taken as a whole lags behind on the average along many of these dimensions. This is a stubborn reality, and it has consequences. And it can't be easily reconciled with a pat account about racism and discrimination that lets us sort of relax into saying, when we finally get this right, when we get rid of racism, when we reach the post-racial society, everything's going to be okay. Well, no, because along the way here, as we've not yet been in this racial nirvana, facts on the ground have been created. Blighted lives have played themselves out, and human difficulties have developed. And these are stark, they're staring us in the face, they're the subtext for a lot of our politics, they're the story behind the story. So when Gates, a Harvard professor, God bless him, I certainly intend him no ill will, but when he trots out this story about a racist rogue police officer, and when he begins to embrace this rhetoric of racial profiling, frankly, and when the president buys into this, unlike what the wisdom that he typically exhibits, President Obama, in conducting public affairs, makes a huge mistake by buying into this. It is a distraction from the real story. The real story, 2.25 million Americans, half of whom are black, under lock and key on a given day. The real story, stop and frisk as the police technique du jour in city after city around this country, where the rubber hits the road in terms of profiling, where people are getting sent off to Rikers Island because they had a joint in their pocket, and so forth and so on. Where the real story is kids learning how to be men from other kids who've been locked up for 5 years and then get out, because they all get out, go back to the same neighborhoods and strut their new bodies and their tattoos and their hardened attitudes as a part of the social counseling that ends up forming the normative structure of these communities. And I'm talking about tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of them in and out of this system. If I may say so, how dare a Harvard professor and a president of the United States cheapen the serious political conversation that we have to have about locking up millions of our fellow citizens by repairing to a pat, all too familiar storyline about racism and profiling in the abstract against black men in general, even on Martha's Vineyard. I'm telling you that that is not the politics of change that we were promised during the campaign of 2008. In my mind, if we're going to look these problems of disparity between racial groups in the United States, disparity of human development and acquired capacity for functioning, look these problems directly on, then the solutions that suggest themselves to me are building a system of social supports, of mutual support that includes everyone and that therefore eases the difficult situation of people who are especially disadvantaged, which people will be disproportionately present in the African American population, in a disadvantaged racial minority population. So we need, to fix the schools. We actually, I think, need to spend a lot more than we do spend on educating our young people. Our sentences are way too long, okay? Let's just start with something very specific and very concrete. You can put a person in jail for 5 years, for 10 years, or 20 years for the same crime. We're deciding on 10 years to 20 years when 5 years would be enough, okay? The deterrent value, the additional amount of leverage that you get over a criminal to keep them from breaking the law in the first place, associated with making the sentences longer, is de minimis. It's essentially nothing. The research shows this. 3 strikes and you're outlaws. The laws that say if you do a crime 3 times, you can be sentenced to 25 years for life. The laws that have got the jails of California overflowing they're madness as policy. They're expressive political symbols capturing the anger of people at social dysfunction and allowing politicians to show that they're responsive to that anger. I've had some problems with the law, including being arrested for possession of a controlled substance. Now I've just advocated decriminalizing the possession of controlled substances. That sounds a bit self-serving, and perhaps it is. Certainly having the personal experience of being, locked up, not for a long time. I was locked up overnight. Being accused of a serious crime, I was accused of assaulting someone. The charges were later dropped in the context of a dispute-laden personal relationship. The charges were later dropped. For what it's worth, I was not guilty of the charge, but I was accused of assaulting somebody and therefore confronting real criminal liability, at least potentially. Didn't work out that way, but there I was in that spotlight. The stigma, when you're signaled out as someone who has done something wrong, that stays with you, even if you haven't done the thing that people think you might have done, and so forth and so on. I suppose that also has affected me. I'd also say the way that I came up in Chicago, not a poor family, not a, sort of stereotypical sort of ghetto upbringing, if you will, but nevertheless, one with some rough edges and one where, there were people with one foot to either side of the law who were, regular presences in my young world as a boy and a young man growing up in Chicago. My uncle would take me to the state pen to visit friends of his who were incarcerated. He wanted me to have the experience of going there. But for the grace of God go I, he would say to me about these people who were in prison. I think that kind of thing surely has had some effect on me also. I think I'd decriminalize. I think I would heavily regulate and control. I think if you're asking me, and my mouth is no prayer book, but my view is, I'd view addiction to these substances as a medical problem, and I would treat it accordingly. What little I knew about the history of drug control policy in the United States leaves me thinking that a hugely important moment came when the lawyers went out over the doctors on this matter. That is to say, when the medical profession basically surrendered, and perhaps they had no choice in the matter, their autonomy to handle the difficult problems of addiction to substances, which is a medical problem, to the anti-drug crusaders, legal crusaders, who wanted to make everything against the law and then throw people in prison. Just as we can see in retrospect that criminalizing the consumption of alcohol proved not to be the solution to the very real problem of drunkenness, so too what I want to say is the very real problem of the human susceptibility to addiction isn't best dealt with by building prisons and throwing people into jails. I think the war on terror is the thing that I'm most terrified of. Now, that may seem to be coming out of, I don't know, left field or the stratosphere. I'm not sure where that comes from, because we've been talking about race and domestic American policy and drugs and whatnot, and I'm not a foreign policy expert by any means. I'm not. And yet, Iraq, Afghanistan, not just that, but the whole kind of taking over of our defense and security establishment by this mentality, this kind of Orwellian war against a shape-shifting and faceless and almost undefinable enemy, the war that never ends. I mean, when is it going to be over? The war that someone even dare not say, we're not fighting it anymore. I mean, it's kind of, I'm not only talking about the threats to our civil liberties from surveillance. I'm not only talking about the damage to our national reputation from the actions that we've taken with enemy combatants and others, detaining these people, kidnapping these people, torturing these people. I'm not only talking about that. I'm talking about getting used to being at war. The country's been at war for 10 years, for a decade. We're settling into being at war. That's terrifying in the extreme to me. We've defined this problem like we were little Israel sitting there surrounded by great Arab armies in the myth, in the storyline. We've got to engage in the drone-operated assassinations of potential enemies. We've got to accept as standard operating procedure the collateral damage in which whole families are wiped out, sometimes by accident, sometimes because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the best we have to say for it is that it wasn't our intention to kill them. We've got this volunteer army where 9/10 of the population sits back on our haunches, hoping that the price of gasoline doesn't go too high, while we've got a professionalized fighting class. And what do you think those people are going to do when we're finished with them in Afghanistan and Iraq? They're coming home. They're coming home with all of the scars of battle, with all of the habituated attitudes of violence, with everything that's serving in a theater of combat, sometimes 2 and 3 times over, will affect in the life of a human being. We're biting off a huge headache here. And the fact that we don't talk about it, that we don't have a politics in which this question of war and peace can even get onto the table so that we can open up our Orwell, our 1984, or Animal Farm or whatever, and read the political text that's being spouted to us on the television right off of the page. The fact that we don't have a politics robust enough to actually debate whether or not we want to be a country permanently at war, that's what keeps me from sleeping at night. I'm left, okay, and sometimes radically, and sometimes I even shock myself with the degree of radicalness in my own, that I'm allowing to come out in my old age. On the other hand, there's some of my, I got the reputation of being a conservative because I was one of these personal responsibility guys, before Bill Cosby made it popular, talking about how black people need to pull up our socks, how we need to take better care of our children, and get our acts together, and how that was an internal difficulty that we needed to actually address within ourselves. And I even flirted a little bit with, sort of black nationalism. I mean, I had more than a kind word to say about the minister Louis Farrakhan. I once wrote a piece about the Million Man March, 1995 Million Man March, Washington, D.C., Louis Farrakhan, which is remembered, I think, nowadays mostly because Farrakhan gave a very odd and rambling and in places incoherent and in other places kind of weird speech. It went on for 90 minutes or something like that at this Million Man March. But the thing that I remember was 1 million, more or less, African-American men assembled in one place, emphasizing communal uplift, responsibility, and a positive agenda. And I was very much taken by that. And I guess that still lingers in me to some degree. I also have this anti-political correctness thing that's a part of my persona. I mean, I just haven't drunk anybody's Kool-Aid, you know what I mean? I mean, I just can't go with the flow. I mean, when Chris Matthews thinks Obama is great, that's when I start saying, okay, let me take another look at this Obama. You know what I mean? Because this is, so I just can't, and therefore I may be hard to pigeonhole because I'm going to be on, the contrarian side or whatever the thing might be. I think the war on terror is horrible. I hated what the Bush administration was doing. On the other hand, I didn't think that we should criminalize those policy differences by going after these people after the fact. And I thought that all that bandwagon stuff about how Eric Holder ought to, let's prosecute him and let's indict Bush and Cheney, and how I thought it was crazy and irresponsible. I'm likely to say something like that. The one thing that I want to say is that the progressive forces in our country, including those in the press, I don't think do the cause any good by not reporting with brutal, critical candor and scrutiny on this administration every bit as much as they would do on any other administration. Now, I hope that in the fullness of time, we're only 9 months into this, 8 months into this, I will be proven wrong about this, but I have detected from time to time a reticence and a kind of, as if the campaign were still going on, and we all kind of know that people who are covering campaigns in the press develop allegiances, and that colors the way in which they do their reporting. I don't think that's disputable. I think there's plenty of evidence to that effect on all sides. But the campaign is long since over, and we really need a hard-hitting, critical press. I mean, I see elements of it, but I don't see it to its full extent. I'm talking about, for example, on these questions of war and peace. I don't take it as a given at all that we need to be doubling down in Afghanistan. I don't take that as a given at all. That's the direction in which the president is going. I want hard-hitting, critical assessment of that from the liberal and progressive media. Not merely he's our guy, we got to protect him kind of reaction that is somehow what I feel like I'm getting. For my little small part in my little corner of the public policy world, and I write about race and affirmative action and racial discrimination and domestic policy and prisons and all this kind of thing. I'm sure determined to do that. I'm determined, as I was trying to do in reaction to this Henry Louis Gates affair, to call the president out when I think he's making mistakes or when I think he's got it wrong, and to do that as a part of my responsibility as a public intellectual and so forth and so on. So for what that may be worth, I'll say that. That's right. My pastor, this little church that I used to go to when I was a better Christian than I am now, who and his wife have devoted their physicians, Harvard-trained physician, who's devoted his entire life to building a church in a community in Boston and has helped thousands and thousands of people, and is as pious and as serious and as humane a human being as you might imagine. Reverend Ray Hammond. I'm glad to be able to put him at the top of my list. No, I'm not running for anything in Boston. I don't need his endorsement. But he's certainly a good man. Another guy I think of who I admire tremendously is Ernesto Cortez, who's a well-known community organizer, the Industrial Areas Foundation. He works out of Austin, Texas, but he's organizing throughout the Southwest. And I've known him for 20 25 years. And I tell you that these community organizers in some of these places, you know, in New Orleans and in Houston and San Antonio and LA, various cities around the Southwest, I've had a chance to interact with them. Down in the Rio Grande Valley, you know, with the Mexican immigrant population and stuff like that, organizing. I've been to, you know, Holiday Inns at the airport, and 500 people wearing the same T-shirt have been jumping up and down inside an auditorium talking about they were going to get a community college education so they could run one of these MRI machines at the hospital or something like that. They were talking about, we want $25 an hour jobs, not minimum wage jobs, and we're prepared to, you know, I just see, not to go on too long about it, but here's a guy who is spending his life, he's a thoughtful, he's an intellectual. This is Ernesto Cortez, the organizer. He's an intellectual, but he's also a practical politician. And when I say that, I don't mean that he's running for office, but I mean he's dealing with the kind of small p politics, getting people together, getting them talking to each other, getting them to feel that they have the capacity to change their lives, getting them organized. I have tremendous respect for that work. I see a political issue here. The President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, elected comfortably in his first year with a very ambitious agenda, inheriting an economic crisis, passing massive fiscal legislation in this stimulus package, which has huge implications down the road, budgetary, tax-wise, and so forth and so on. And having at the top of his agenda reforming healthcare, needs to win this one, right? He wins this one, he gets this done. He is a long way toward a successful first term. He's a long way toward, you know, minimizing whatever setbacks the Democrats might have in the 2010 mid-year elections, midterm elections. And, you know, he's up there with LBJ and FDR in terms of solidifying the 20th, 21st century American welfare state. This is major. Healthcare is major. So the politics of this, as you know, the right wing understands very, very well, is tremendously profound. So I see the policy issues, I see the politics, but I also see the moral issue, because this really is about who we are as a people here. In this healthcare debate, now, you know, everybody knows the history. Clinton's tried, they failed early in their administration, and they suffered serious setbacks in the '94 elections, and the rest is history. Obama is teetering here. He tries, he fails. Then we've got two failures, right, to try to do this. And the fact that we are the only advanced industrial democracy where people can get sick and languish because they can't afford care, or where people are blocked in access to this system because they don't have access to insurance, which is only available through certain narrow portals and under certain very restricted conditions. The fact that we're the only society that hasn't embraced this idea that no one should go without access to these services, regardless of their financial condition, and no one should be saddled with a lifetime of debt because they have the misfortune of falling ill. That's a major moral issue. So I see it as a moment of big moral challenge for the country. I want the president to succeed here, and I want the country to move in this direction. There's a lot to pick over and argue about on the policy front. I get the public option because it's the stalking horse. I know I'm not supposed to say this. I know that this is not the line. It's the camel's nose under the tent for what I think is the correct solution to this problem, which is the so-called single-payer system, which is Medicare for all, which is the government stands behind, collects the taxes to pay for, regulates the provision of, but stands behind the provision of these services to everybody. That's not to stop somebody who has a lot of money from buying something extra. That's to say, here's the government and we're providing this to everybody. Now, people have said that they can't get that done politically here in the United States, and I see that very clearly. The vitriolic and hysterical attacks against the president's efforts to reform healthcare, labeling them socialism, talking of them in terms of fascist and government, profound government intrusion into the lives of people, when in fact what it is what every other advanced, wealthy, democratic, industrialized country has done, and nothing more, shows me that to come straight out for the single-payer system would probably meet with political failure. Therefore, we have had to invent this end run around the political realities, and as I understand the public option, and I know there'd be a lot of debate about this, that's the main role of it. They say compete with insurance companies. I think what it actually means is compel or coerce or drive insurance companies into a mode of behavior. We're not going to get rid of the insurance middleman here with a single payer system, but we're going to create a public presence in the insurance industry powerful enough to drive the direction of the industry in the way that we, together with regulation, want it to go. And so therein lies the big policy debate. What I think about that is I wish that we had the capacity to go directly at the single payer system. I think what we're doing is messy, so messy that the president can't explain it. And he's pretty good, He's pretty good at explaining stuff, and people still don't really get what's going on because it's messy. There's a lot of demagogic rhetoric, and not only on the right. There's a lot of this, some of this rhetoric about the insurance companies that I hear coming, for example, from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, I wish would be reconsidered. I say this as a guy who I think of myself as on the left, but I think that if you have a system where you say you're selling insurance to people, it's very natural that the companies selling the insurance are going to try to vet claims and minimize the amount of payments that they have to make. If you have a system that says everybody who needs health care gets it, and we're going to make sure that it gets paid for by raising the taxes and providing the requirements on individuals where they have the ability to pay, such as we determine as appropriate, then the insurance issue doesn't come up. So, what am I trying to say about the insurance companies? I think the talk about insurance company profit and insurance company venality as the source of this problem is a byproduct of our unwillingness to confront head-on the sort of deeper moral issue, which is that we should provide the services in terms of healthcare to the people who need them, more or less, regardless of their ability to pay. It's divisive. It's divisive political rhetoric.